I feel like I can finally do a top 10 list of completed fantasy series. For a long time I was pushing this off because it would have been the only 10 that I read. So I didn't have enough to really list any as the top 10, but now I feel like I'm at that point. Really quick, before we get started, let's go over a couple rules. I am going to include sub-series as completed series. So Mistborn Era 1 is going to be a completed series. However, I am not going to include multiple sub-series on this list. So I won't use all 5 sub-series from Realm of the Elderlings. I'll have to pick just one of them. And that's the only rule. So without wasting any time, let's get started with number 10, which might be a surprise to a lot of people. I'm going to go with Lord of the Rings. Now, why is this number 10? Why isn't it in at least the top 5? It's because of how long it's been since I've read this book. I read Lord of the Rings back in around when the movies came out, and then read it again several years ago. So just because of how long ago it's been since the last time I've read it, I can't really do a fair comparison to all the series that I've finished in the last 2 or 3 years. So I remember it being really good and liking it a lot, but I also remember there being parts that I was bored throughout as well. So it's just hard for me to compare, so I don't want to give it a higher ranking than 10. At number 9, you have The Faithful and the Fallen. Now, this is another one where people might be surprised that it's this low on my list, because it has a lot of things I really like. Specifically, it has a ton of action scenes. However, I did get pretty frustrated with the writing. I felt there was, at times, too many point of view characters, and you didn't stick with one of them long enough. You'd be with one for a few pages, and then you'd switch to someone else. So at times it was hard for me to really get in the mindset of following one person. Plus, he had a habit of doing fade to black, where ended up I never had an emotional reaction through a big portion of the series because it was all fade to black and I didn't believe anything was going to stick. At number 8, I'm going to go with Wheel of Time. You can kind of blame this series on me getting into fantasy because I was reading this series and then after finishing decided to see if this Brandon Sanderson guy was any good and picked up Way of Kings, and that's how I found BookTube, and that led me to read the couple hundred fantasy books I've read in the last 2 years. So that all started with Wheel of Time. So considering that, why is this so low on the list? The main reason is most of the books, I actually struggled at the beginning and the middle of them. I really enjoyed the ending, which got me excited for the next book, but the slow pacing at the beginning of each of the books really was a struggle for me until I got to the last 4 books. Loved the last 4 books of the series. But overall, due to the amount of time that I didn't actively enjoy reading, I can't list this any higher than 8. Coming in at number 7, you have Lightbringer by Brent Weeks. This was one of the first fantasy series I read after finding BookTube, and I really enjoyed almost this entire series. I do understand why some people don't like it with how much he talks about sex and describing people's bodies. I get it. And the ending was not the most satisfying ending, and that's what's keeping this from being ranked even higher on this list. But overall, really enjoyable series. Probably one of the more underrated series I've seen on BookTube. I loved all the twists and turns. However, I do feel he went a little bit overboard, and that's what made the ending so hard to land just right. At number 6, we have the Farseer trilogy. So the first sub-series of Realm of the Elderlings. This is the series that really convinced me that even though I'm not generally a character-driven reader, that if it's done right, I will still love the series. Mostly I lean towards plot, but you get characters this good, I'm going to enjoy it still. At number 5, you could argue that this is historical fiction and not fantasy, but I'm going to call it historical fantasy and include it. It's going to be The Warlord Chronicle by Bernard Cornwell. This is a King Arthur retelling, and this was just absolutely phenomenal. The whole story was engaging. It's one of those series where it's a trilogy, and I can't pick which of the 3 books I like the most. They were all that good. The next series is Rhaenyra Revelations by Michael J. Sullivan. The banter in this series is second to none and has one of the most satisfying conclusions to any fantasy series I've read. So some of these series, they're lower down because they didn't land the ending. Rhaenyra absolutely nailed it. Now for the top 3, we're starting off with Mistborn Era 1. This is an absolutely phenomenal trilogy by Brandon Sanderson, and each book is very unique. So they're all great, but book 1 you have this heist story with a very charismatic protagonist. Book 2 you have more political intrigue and siege and trust issues. And then in book 3, the fate of the world literally rests on their shoulders and they're going up against a god. So stakes don't really get much higher than what you have in the 3rd book. And at number 2, you have The Greatcoats by Sebastian de Castell. The banter in this series is right up there with Rhaenyra, and the friend group is one of the best friend groups in all of fantasy. And he does something incredible where he switches between first person and second person, which normally I would have hated that, but it works so well in this story. And overall, it's just a swashbuckling good time. And then coming in at my favorite completed series that I've read so far, it's going to be Alex Varys by Benedict Jacka. This is the urban fantasy series for people that don't like Dresden, specifically because of the character of Dresden. In a lot of ways, he's Dresden's opposite, as in he doesn't have a lot of physical power like Dresden does, and he also doesn't describe people by their body nearly as often as Dresden. Instead, he has to plan things out and strategize, which is not something that Dresden does all that well. But similar to Dresden, he's kind of an outsider where the quote-unquote good guys and bad guys both kind of hate him and don't like working with him, but they're happy to use him, which is a similar situation Dresden's in. So he has to make alliances where he can, and things get complicated as you move throughout the series. So those are my top 10 favorite series that I've read. Let me know in the comments, what are some of your favorite completed series? And until next time, bye.